Hello dear viewers, a very warm welcome to our channel. In this video we are going to have a look at some of the top symptoms indicated by bad ignition switch. Is your car not starting up like it used to? The problem could be a failing ignition switch. The ignition switch is a very critical component in your vehicles that controls the flow of electricity from the battery to the starter motor to the ignition system and to other systems as well. When it starts to go bad, it can cause lots of problems. It is responsible for starting the engine. It is responsible for powering the electrical system in your vehicle. Once the ignition switch is turned on, there are lots of systems that are becoming functional. So when the ignition switch starts to fail, it can cause lots of problems that can be frustrating and even sometimes very dangerous. Let's have a look at some of the top symptoms of bad ignition switch so you can identify the issue early and get it addressed as soon as possible. 1. Engine won't start. One of the most obvious signs of a bad ignition switch is the engine not starting when you turn the ignition key. This can happen for a few reasons. The switch may not be making a proper electrical connection to the starter motor, or it may not be sending the right signal to the engine control module to start the engine. If you turn the ignition key and nothing happens, it's a good indication that the ignition switch needs to be checked. So, refusal to start, engine won't start can be one of the most obvious signs of bad ignition switch. 2. Intermittent starting issue. Sometimes the ignition switch may work sometimes, but not other times. This can be tricky to diagnose, as it may seem like the problem is elsewhere in the electrical system. But if you notice that your car starts fine one day and then struggles to start the next day, it is likely due to a failing ignition switch that is intermittently making the right connection. The ignition might connect sometime and might refuse to connect sometime, leading to intermittent starting. 3. Dashboard lights flickering. When the ignition switch is going bad, you may notice the dashboard signs flickering or dimming when you turn the ignition key. This is a sign that the switch is not providing a steady, reliable flow of electricity to the vehicle's electrical system. Over time, the contacts inside the ignition switch can wear down, causing intermittent connection, leading to dashboard lights flickering. 4. Accessories shutting off. Similarly, if you notice that your vehicle accessories like the radio, like the lights and charging ports are randomly shutting off or resetting, it could be a problem with the ignition switch. As the switch fails, it may not be providing consistent power supply to these systems, causing them to cut out unexpectedly. So if you happen to notice that accessories are shutting down without you turning the ignition switch off, it could be an indication that there is some loose connection causing intermittent interruption inside the ignition switch. 5. Key won't turn. In some cases, bad ignition switch can actually prevent you from being able to turn the ignition key in the first place. This can happen if the switch is stuck or if the switch is binding, preventing the key from fully engaging the ignition. If you find yourself struggling to turn the ignition key, it is a clear sign that the ignition switch needs to be replaced. So refusal of the key to rotate as you turn the ignition key inside the cylinder could be caused by some mechanical problems, some kind of jamming inside the cylinder, preventing the ignition key from functioning properly. 6. Electrical issues. A bad ignition switch can disrupt the flow of electricity to most of the electrical systems like the lights, like accessories, like radios, and all those powered by the ignition switch. So if you happen to notice that there are electrical issues associated with power supply related problems, that could be an indication of a failing ignition switch. 7. Engine stalling while driving. A failing ignition switch can suddenly cut power to the engine while the vehicle is in motion. So if your engine shuts down unexpectedly, if the engine starts to stall in the middle of driving, It could be due to a bad ignition switch not supplying consistent electricity to the ignition system and all electrical systems requiring power supply. For example, if there is a loose connection that comes on and off when the vehicle is being driven as a result of a failing ignition switch, power supply to the ignition might be interrupted, power supply to the electronic control unit might be interrupted. All this can lead to engine stall while driving. 8. Starter motor engages, but engine doesn't start. Now, there are times where the ignition switch, when turned to a start position, the engine keeps on cranking, but the engine won't be started. This can be caused by bad ignition switch that is not providing electricity to the ignition system, but it is supplying electricity to the starter motor. There are times when the circuit of the ignition switch becomes faulty and it will not provide electricity to the ignition system and the control module, but it supplies electricity to the starter motor. Let's say the starter motor is being activated when the ignition switch is turned to the start position, but there is no power supply to the ignition system. Now, this will make your vehicle to crank continuously, but the engine will not start because the ignition system is not powered by the ignition switch. 9. When the ignition key refuses to be removed from the cylinder, when it stucks. There are cases where a malfunctioning ignition switch that causes the key to get stuck on one of the positions. Either it could be stuck on the on position or it could be stuck on the off position. This usually happens when there are mechanical related problems. Mechanical problems can prevent the key from getting removed from the cylinder. It will either stuck in one of the positions. That could be an indication of a failing ignition switch as well. And finally, number 10, electrical burning smell. A failing ignition switch can sometimes overheat and produce burning electrical smell. This usually happens when there is poor connection between the terminals inside the ignition switch. The main task of the ignition switch is to receive power from the battery terminal and then distribute that power to the different terminal, to the accessory terminal, to the starter motor terminal, and to the ignition terminal. If there is loose connection between these two, that can lead to arcing. That small arcing can overheat the ignition switch and it can generate a burning smell. So a burning smell as a result of loose electrical connection can also be an indication of a failing ignition switch. So, dear viewers, if you happen to notice any of these symptoms, it is very important to address this problem related to a bad ignition switch as soon as possible in order to prevent further damage or safety issues. If you know how to fix it immediately. If you don't know how to fix it, and then have a professional mechanic to diagnose and replace the ignition switch as soon as possible. A failing ignition switch can manifest in a variety of ways, from starting related problems to electrical problems throughout the vehicle. By being aware of these top symptoms of a bad ignition switch, you can identify the problem early and get your car back on the road safely. Remember, if you suspect your ignition switch is going bad, it is best to have inspected and replaced immediately by a qualified mechanic. By doing so, you can guarantee safe drive of your vehicle. Well, dear viewers, that is all we have for you regarding symptoms of a bad ignition switch. If you like what has been presented, please smash the like button. If you are new here, do consider subscribing and turn on notifications so that you will be notified whenever we come up with another video. Until then, stay safe.